At my husband Arthur's funeral, a day from mourning, his children and their spouses cornered me. They called me a gold digger, demanding I leave our home, suggesting I belonged in assisted living. Through my silent tears, I simply said, okay. They thought they'd won, but they had no idea their lives were about to become very, very complicated. I'm sharing my story now. Please like, share, and let me know where you're listening from. The heavy scent of lilies still clung to the air, a mournful perfume that filled our home, the home Arthur and I had shared for 38 beautiful years. My 64th birthday had passed quietly a few months prior, celebrated only by Arthur and me, just as he had liked it. Now, barely a week after he'd been laid to rest, the silence in the house was deafening, amplified by the lingering echoes of condolence calls and hushed footsteps. My heart felt like a lead weight in my chest, a constant dull ache that no amount of tears seemed to ease. Arthur, my steady, loving Arthur, was gone. Yet, even in my profound grief, a curious secret lay buried within me. A secret of monumental proportions that, for now, I intended to keep hidden. The $28 million inheritance Arthur had quietly bestowed upon me, a fortune accumulated over a lifetime of astute investments and shrewd business dealings, was one part of it. The other, an architectural masterpiece of steel and glass, a towering skyscraper in the heart of New York City, stood as a testament to his foresight and our shared, yet unspoken, legacy. Arthur had always been a man of quiet power, and he had ensured I was well protected, far beyond what anyone suspected. The funeral itself had been a dignified affair, a testament to Arthur's well-respected life. His children from his first marriage, Ben and Claire, had spoken with an appropriate somberness, recalling fond memories of their father. Even his ex-wife, Susan, had offered a few well-chosen words, praising Arthur's character. Their words felt like a fragile veneer, momentarily masking the underlying currents I'd always sensed but never fully acknowledged. The shift, subtle at first, became undeniable during the reception held back at our house. The atmosphere, initially heavy with shared sorrow, gradually morphed into something colder, more calculating. Family members, distant relatives, and close ones alike moved through the sun-drenched rooms, their gazes lingering a little too long on the antique furniture, the original artworks, the ornate silver tea sets that had been staples of our entertaining for decades. They weren't just grieving, they were appraising. It was Brenda, Daniel's wife, who made the first, most jarring pronouncement. She was Arthur's niece by marriage, a woman whose thinly veiled ambition had always made me uneasy. As I stood near the mantelpiece, a photograph of Arthur's beaming face clutched in my hand, Brenda approached, a tight, artificial smile on her lips. Her eyes, however, were sharp with contempt. "Such a grand home, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "You certainly knew how to pick them, didn't you? A real gold digger's dream." The words, softly spoken, were like a slap across my face. They hung in the air, acidic and cruel, but I merely tightened my grip on the frame, offering only a polite, if strained, nod. To engage would be to acknowledge the venom. The day dragged on, a blur of forced smiles and insincere condolences. Finally, as the last of the guests departed, leaving behind a battlefield of crumpled tissues and half-eaten sandwiches, Brenda returned. She found me in the living room, gathering stray coats. Her artificial smile was gone, replaced by a hard, determined set to her jaw. "All right, Eleanor, enough with the act," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You can stop pretending to power the grieving widow. We all know what you are." Before I could even process her audacity, Ben and Claire, along with Daniel, Brenda's husband and Arthur's nephew, entered the room. They didn't come to my defense. Instead, they formed a silent, menacing semicircle around me, herding me towards the kitchen. It felt like a tribunal, an impromptu court convened in the very heart of the home Arthur and I had built together. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen, harsh and unforgiving, illuminated their faces, stripping away any pretense of familial warmth. "Eleanor," Ben began, his voice surprisingly firm, "this house, it's simply too much for one person. It's enormous, and the upkeep, the expenses, they're astronomical." Claire nodded in agreement, her gaze cold and distant. "Father worked his entire life for this, for everything. It's not right for it to be wasted." Daniel, usually jovial, remained silent, avoiding my gaze. His lack of eye contact was a fresh betrayal, a deeper cut than any of Brenda's insults. I had always considered Daniel a friend, someone who respected Arthur's choices. Now he simply stood, a silent accomplice. Brenda stepped forward, her hands on her hips. Let's be honest, Eleanor. You never worked a day in your life. You lived off Arthur's money, didn't you? Always the socialite, the lady of leisure. Her words were a torrent of accusations, painting me as a parasitic figure, someone unworthy of the life I had shared with Arthur. Now that Arthur's gone, it's time you started looking for your own place, somewhere more suitable. Somewhere more suitable? I finally managed to whisper, my voice raw with unshed tears, though my resolve was hardening with each cruel word. Claire chimed in, her tone almost saccharine. Yes, dear, we've been looking into some lovely assisted living facilities. They offer so many wonderful activities, companionship, peace of mind. Assisted living. The words echoed in my ears, a final crushing blow. They were suggesting I move into a care home like an invalid, despite the fact I was perfectly capable and healthy. They wanted to strip me of my independence, my dignity, and cast me aside as if I were a burden. My heart was breaking, truly, utterly breaking. But beneath the profound hurt, a new steely resolve began to form, a fire igniting in the ashes of my grief. I looked at each of them, at Ben's rigid posture, Claire's impassive face, Brenda's triumphant sneer, and Daniel's cowardly averted eyes. A profound sadness washed over me for the man I had loved, whose family could be so cruel. But then, an even stronger sense of purpose took hold. They had underestimated me. Every single one of them. Okay, I said, the single word cutting through the tense silence, surprisingly steady. It was quiet, firm, and entirely unexpected. Their shocked expressions were almost comical. They had expected an argument, tears, pleading. Instead, they got compliance. Later that evening, long after they had reluctantly left, seemingly confused but ultimately satisfied with my apparent surrender, I walked through the house, the grand home that was no longer mine in their eyes. With a strange sense of detachment, I packed 2 small suitcases, a few changes of clothes, some essential toiletries, the photograph of Arthur from the mantelpiece, and the small, worn leather journal he had given me on our first anniversary. I left everything else, every piece of furniture, every heirloom, every expensive trinket they had coveted. I left it all behind, a silent offering to their greed. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying me into the anonymity of the night, I looked back at the darkened windows of the house, a house filled with memories, now tainted by betrayal. A house that, for them, represented wealth and status. But for me, it was now simply a place I had once lived. My real life, I decided, would begin now. And theirs, I promised myself with a quiet, fierce determination, would get very, very complicated. The generic warmth of the Hampton Inn lobby felt like a strange embrace after the cold rejection of my own home. I checked in under my maiden name, Eleanor Morrison, a small act of reclamation that felt surprisingly empowering. The room, impersonal and efficient, was a welcome sanctuary. I set down my 2 small suitcases, the only tangible link to my past life, and sank onto the edge of the bed. The weight of grief still pressed upon me, a dull ache beneath the surface. But now a flicker of something else had ignited, a cold, determined resolve. My first call, after a moment of quiet reflection, was to Robert Maxwell. Robert wasn't just Arthur's attorney. He had been my attorney for 15 years, a trusted confidant and the architect of my financial future. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and familiar. Robert, it's Eleanor, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to meet with you, privately, and soon. There was a brief pause on the other end, a knowing silence that spoke volumes. Robert was a shrewd man, experienced in the intricate dance of family dynamics and wealth. Eleanor, my deepest condolences again, he said softly. I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you. Family trouble, I presume. You presume correctly, I replied, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. The vultures are circling, Robert. They've already dismissed me from the house. suggested assisted living. I recounted Brenda's cruel demands, the accusations of being a gold digger, and the unified front of Ben, Claire, and Daniel, who had so readily cast me aside. I spoke of their complete disregard for my decades of contribution to Arthur's life, my quiet support, my management of our household that allowed him to focus on his business empire. They saw none of it, or rather chose not to see it. Robert listened patiently, occasionally interjecting with a hum of understanding. "Do they have any idea, Eleanor," he finally asked, his voice low and serious, "of your actual situation? The full scope of what Arthur did for you and what you've built yourself?" "None whatsoever," I confirmed, a grim satisfaction settling over me. "They believe I am penniless, dependent, and utterly vulnerable, just as Arthur and I intended, should this day ever come." There was a longer pause this time, a thoughtful silence. "So," Robert said, his tone shifting, "we proceed with the plan then? The one we've meticulously crafted over the years?" "We proceed," I affirmed, my voice ringing with certainty. This wasn't a snap decision born of anger. This was the culmination of foresight, a carefully constructed contingency plan that Arthur, in his wisdom, had initiated years ago, preparing me for a future he knew might hold challenges. He had understood the nature of his family, their latent sense of entitlement, and had ensured I would not be left exposed. "Excellent," Robert said, a hint of steel in his voice. "The necessary transfers can be completed within 48 hours. A full restructuring, consolidating all your holdings, will take approximately 2 weeks, ensuring everything is legally secured for a decade. Beyond that, the continuous process of asset protection will ensure your legacy for generations." My breath hitched. "A decade?" "Yes, Eleanor, more than a decade in truth. Everything has been legally yours for over a decade. Arthur was very thorough. They can contest it all they want. They'll lose. Not just lose, but they'll make themselves look utterly foolish in the process." A small, genuine smile touched my lips. Arthur, ever the strategist, even in death. "About the house, Robert," I said, a new thought forming. "I have a specific request. I don't want to move on it just yet. I want them to show me exactly who they are first. I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves." Robert chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "An excellent strategy, Eleanor. We will hold our cards close. Let them reveal theirs." We discussed the next steps, the quiet, meticulous work that would soon begin behind the scenes, invisible to the eyes of those who thought they had won. The next morning, driven by a morbid curiosity and a nascent desire to observe my unwitting adversaries, I drove past the house. My house. The familiar oak-lined street, the grand facade that had been home to so much joy and sorrow, now presented a scene of bustling activity. A large moving truck, emblazoned with a local company's logo, was parked in the driveway. Boxes were being carried inside, and others, presumably my belongings, were being loaded into a smaller, separate truck labeled Storage Solutions. Standing imperiously on the front porch, directing the movers with an almost proprietorial air, was Brenda. She gestured with a dismissive wave toward a box, her voice carrying faintly in the morning air. It was clear. She wasn't just helping to clear out a superfluous widow, she was moving in. The audacity was breathtaking, yet somehow entirely predictable. A text message vibrated my phone, pulling me from my silent observation. It was Daniel. "Hope you found a nice place, Eleanor. Brenda's getting Dad's office organized. Looks like a big job sorting through all his old papers." A bitter laugh escaped me. Arthur's old papers. They thought they were sifting through the remnants of his business empire. They were only finding what he wanted them to find. The real business files, the truly sensitive documents, were tucked away securely in a safety deposit box at First National, a box they had no knowledge of, accessible only by me and Robert. Let them organize. They would find nothing but dusty ledgers and obsolete reports. My next stop was First National Bank. I walked in, not as Mrs. Eleanor Arthur Caldwell, the widow, but as Eleanor Morrison, a woman with a purpose. I requested a meeting with Olivia Reed, my personal banker. Olivia, a sharp, intelligent woman who had handled Arthur's and my private accounts for years, greeted me with a sympathetic smile, offering her condolences. "Olivia, I said, handing her a sealed envelope Robert had prepared. I need to initiate some substantial transfers and account restructuring, effective immediately. As Olivia opened the envelope and began to read, her polite smile slowly faded, replaced by an expression of widening disbelief. Her eyes scanned the documents, her brows furrowing, then widening again. She looked up at me, a silent question in her gaze. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. These are substantial assets. Far beyond what we had on file under your joint accounts." I merely offered a small, knowing smile. "Arthur was a private man, Olivia, and very thorough." Olivia nodded, her professional composure quickly returning, though a spark of awe lingered in her eyes. "Understood, Mrs. Morrison. I will initiate these transfers and begin the restructuring process immediately. This will take some time, but rest assured everything will be handled with the utmost discretion and efficiency." As she moved to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. The first invisible gears had begun to turn. The world outside the Hampton Inn continued its relentless churn, oblivious to the silent storm brewing within me. My phone, a constant companion, began to chime with increasing urgency. Brenda's name flashed across the screen, followed by voicemail after voicemail. Her tone shifted from feigned concern to barely concealed annoyance, then to outright demanding. "Eleanor, pick up! We need to discuss things. Your things are in storage. Call me back." Each message was a testament to her growing impatience, and I let them all go unanswered. Let them stew, let them wonder. My silence was its own form of communication. My mornings were dedicated to a different kind of communication. I would retreat to the hotel's business center, a quiet haven of humming computers and hushed whispers, and make calls that, if overheard, would shock my adversaries senseless. These weren't calls of a vulnerable widow, but of a woman in command, a woman overseeing an empire they didn't even know existed. My first calls were to the property management companies overseeing my 3 Manhattan apartment complexes. Each building, a testament to prudent investment and careful management, was thriving. I discussed occupancy rates, upcoming renovations, and tenant concerns, offering directives and making executive decisions with a quiet authority that belied my unassuming hotel surroundings. These properties, a blend of residential and commercial spaces, generated a steady, substantial income that far surpassed what most people imagined. Next, I held a conference call with my investment advisor, reviewing portfolio performances, discussing market trends, and authorizing new investments. The figures we discussed, the sheer scale of the assets I held, were staggering. Arthur had not just given me wealth, he had empowered me with the knowledge and resources to manage and grow it independently. The most satisfying calls, however, were with the architects. For 2 hours, I meticulously went over the renovation plans for my Soho building, a true gem in my portfolio. This building, a little secret, as Arthur had affectionately called it, was something I had acquired 15 years ago using funds from my first marriage, a tidy sum that my first husband's family had settled upon me. At the time, it had been a significant investment, a statement of my own independence. Now, after years of strategic renovations and a booming real estate market, it was valued at a staggering $28 million. Its monthly rent income alone comfortably exceeded Arthur's highly respected consulting firm's entire yearly earnings. The irony was not lost on me. While they squabbled over the scraps of what they thought was Arthur's estate, I commanded an income stream that dwarfed his legacy. Just as the final details of a facade restoration were being settled, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Robert. His voice was calm, but I detected an underlying current of anticipation. "Eleanor," he began, "I have news. As expected, they've made their first official move. They've retained an attorney." "Oh," I replied, a small knowing smile playing on my lips. "And who is the unfortunate soul they've chosen to represent them in their misguided quest?" "Michael Hayes," Robert stated. "A decent enough fellow, but easily outmaneuvered when the facts are clear. He called me this morning. Apparently the family is concerned about asset distribution and feels it's imperative to have a formal will reading. They're particularly keen to understand the specifics of Arthur's estate." I almost laughed aloud. Concerned about asset distribution, I mused. That's a polite way of saying they want to know how much they're getting and how quickly. Precisely. Robert confirmed, and he set the will reading for Monday afternoon. His office, 2 o'clock sharp. Excellent, I said, my voice crisp and clear. The stage was being set. Eleanor, Robert continued, his tone turning more serious, I need to ask you one last time, are you truly ready for this? Once we walk into that room, there's no going back. The lines will be drawn. The truth in all its complexity will be revealed. There will be no room for reconciliation after this. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Arthur's kind face, recalling our quiet conversations in the evenings, the meticulous planning we had undertaken together. He had prepared me for this moment, not just financially but emotionally. He had seen the potential for this very scenario and had armed me with the resilience and foresight to face it. Robert, I said, opening my eyes, looking out at the bustling city below, a world unknowingly under my influence. I've been ready for 15 years. The rest of the day was a stark contrast to the quiet strategic planning. I went shopping, not for necessities, but for armor. I chose an elegant navy blue suit, exquisitely tailored, that exuded understated power. It wasn't flashy, but it spoke of quiet confidence and unwavering strength. I purchased a new pair of classic leather pumps in a simple yet striking silk scarf. Then I indulged in a piece of jewelry I rarely wore but now felt was essential. My grandmother's pearl necklace, a string of lustrous, perfectly matched pearls that had adorned generations of strong women in my family. Finally, a small but significant detail, a delicate Cartier watch, a gift from Arthur on a forgotten anniversary that had spent too long in its velvet box. Each item was a deliberate choice, a part of the persona I would embody. For my last night before the inevitable confrontation, I treated myself to a penthouse suite at the Fairmont. The opulent surroundings, the panoramic views of the city, lights shimmering like scattered diamonds, served as a poignant reminder of the life Arthur and I had built and the power I now held. I spread out the legal documents Robert had sent, the detailed ledgers, the property deeds, the investment portfolios. I reviewed every clause, every figure, every contingency. It wasn't about memorizing them. It was about internalizing them, about reaffirming the truth of my position. As the city slept beneath me, I stood by the window, gazing at the sprawling metropolis. I wasn't just Eleanor Caldwell, the gold digger widow. I wasn't just Eleanor Morrison, the woman in a Hampton Inn. I was the architect of my own destiny, a woman of formidable means and unwavering resolve. I was the silent partner, the unseen force, the underestimated power. And tomorrow the world, or at least a small, unsuspecting corner of it, would finally begin to understand who I really was. The grand entrance of Michael Hayes and Associates was a study in polished marble and hushed professionalism. I arrived 15 minutes early, a deliberate choice to project not impatience, but an understated elegance and quiet readiness. My navy blue suit felt like a second skin, the grandmother's pearls a cool, comforting weight against my collarbone, and the Cartier watch a silent reminder of the precision required for this day. I carried only a small, elegant handbag, my posture straight, my expression composed. A young receptionist, barely out of college, sat behind a gleaming desk. She glanced up, her eyes quickly assessing my appearance. A woman of a certain age, neatly dressed, perhaps a relative needing assistance. She offered a polite but perfunctory smile, already turning back to her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting I was likely looking for directions to the restrooms. I took a deep breath, letting a subtle shift in my demeanor convey a quiet authority. "Yes, you can," I said, my voice clear and firm, devoid of any pleasantries. "I am Eleanor Morrison, the widow. I have an appointment at 2 o'clock for the reading of Arthur Caldwell's will." Her head snapped up, her eyes widening slightly. The casual indifference vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then respect. "Oh, Mrs. Morrison, of course. Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Please have a seat. I'll let him know you're here." She gestured towards a plush leather couch. As I settled onto the couch, adjusting the folds of my skirt, A sudden burst of angry voices erupted from down the hallway. The sound was unmistakable. The shrill tones of Brenda intermingled with the deeper, more aggrieved voices of Ben and Claire. I still don't understand why she needs to be here. Brenda's voice, piercing and indignant, cut through the quiet of the office. She's not a real beneficiary. She didn't contribute anything to Arthur's life. She just spent his money. Brenda, keep your voice down, I heard Ben mumble, though his tone lacked any real conviction. No, it's an outrage. She's probably just here to cause trouble, to try and squeeze more out of us. Claire's voice, sharp and cold, joined the fray. I remained perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I kept my gaze fixed on a distant painting, a serene landscape that provided a stark contrast to the unfolding drama. This was exactly what I had expected, precisely the character they expected me to play. The little old lady, quiet and seemingly harmless, easily dismissed, easily overlooked. Let them underestimate me. It was their fatal flaw. Precisely at 2 o'clock, the main doors to the office suite opened again, and Robert Maxwell strode in. He offered me a reassuring, almost imperceptible nod. Behind him, a woman I hadn't met before entered, her presence radiating an undeniable aura of power. She was tall, with impeccably styled silver hair, and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of a seasoned predator. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to flow with her movements, every inch of her suggesting formidable competence. Robert gestured to her. Eleanor, this is Victoria Shaw, my colleague and co-counsel for today's proceedings. Victoria extended a hand, her grip firm and confident. Her voice was low and resonant. Mrs. Morrison, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a great deal about your situation, and I must say I am quite eager to assist. Her smile held a glint of steel, and I sensed an immediate kindred spirit, a woman who understood the intricacies of power and manipulation. Just then, Michael Hayes himself emerged from the hallway, looking rather flushed and harried. He offered a strained smile, clearly having heard the commotion down the hall. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Maxwell, Miss Shaw, please follow me. He ushered us towards a large, imposing conference room. As we entered, the scene within confirmed my earlier suspicions. Ben, Claire, and Daniel, along with Brenda, were already seated, arranged defensively on one side of the long mahogany table. Their expressions ranged from barely contained irritation to outright hostility as their eyes landed on me. Brenda's jaw was clenched, and Claire shot me a venomous glare. Daniel, as usual, avoided my gaze, preferring to stare intently at the polished tabletop. Robert, Victoria, and I took the seats directly opposite them, a clear and deliberate statement. There was no attempt to blend in, no softening of the lines. It was us against them. The table felt like a battleground, an invisible barrier separating two opposing forces. Michael Hayes, looking increasingly uncomfortable, took his place at the head of the table, a thick, legal-sized document clutched in his hands. Arthur's last will and testament. He cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. Thank you all for coming. We are here today to formally read the last will and testament of Arthur Caldwell. His voice was dry, formal, a stark contrast to the emotional undercurrents in the room. He began with the standard openings clauses, the legal jargon flowing over us like a dull river. Then he began to read the bequests. Modest sums were left to various charities Arthur had supported over the years. A local animal shelter, a scholarship fund, a medical research foundation. These were expected, Arthur having always been a man of quiet philanthropy. The family members shifted impatiently, their eyes darting towards me, as if expecting to hear my name next, followed by a list of meager provisions. Finally, Michael Hayes paused, taking a breath. He adjusted his glasses once more, looking directly at Ben, Claire, and Daniel. And to my son, Ben Caldwell, my daughter, Claire Caldwell, and my nephew, Daniel Hayes, I bequeath the sum of $50,000 each. The air in the room seemed to freeze. A stunned silence descended, thick and suffocating. The family's faces, moments before alight with a mixture of greed and anticipation, crumpled into expressions of utter shock. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, flickered from Michael Hayes to each other. $50,000. It was far, far less than they had ever imagined. The collective gasp that escaped them was almost audible, a stark testament to their shattered expectations. I remained still, my face a mask of serene composure. The game, I knew, had just begun. This is where the truth truly starts to unravel. If you're finding this story as gripping as I hope, please make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. Now back to the reading of Arthur's will. The heavy silence in the conference room after Michael Hayes announced the paltry sum of $50,000 for Ben, Claire, and Daniel was quickly shattered by a collective intake of breath from the family. Their faces, a mixture of disbelief and growing indignation, were a sight to behold. But the true bombshell was yet to drop. Michael, seemingly unfazed by the sudden tension, continued to read, his voice maintaining its flat legal cadence. "And to my dear wife, Eleanor Morrison Holloway," he enunciated, pausing slightly, as if to underscore the gravity of the words, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, both current and future, to be hers, absolutely and without encumbrance." The room plunged into an even deeper silence, one so profound it seemed to absorb all sound. The air crackled with unspoken shock. Ben, Claire, Daniel, and Brenda sat frozen, their eyes, helm and disbelieving, fixed on me. They processed the words, then reprocessed them, their minds visibly struggling to reconcile this reality with their deeply ingrained expectations. It was as if the ceiling had collapsed around them, leaving them exposed and bewildered. Brenda, ever the first to recover from a shock with renewed aggression, finally found her voice. It was sharp enough to cut glass, laced with a venomous disbelief. "Repeat that," she demanded, her gaze darting from Michael Hayes to me, as if daring him to retract the words. "Repeat the last part." Michael Hayes, though looking slightly uncomfortable, maintained his professional composure. He consulted the document again, his finger tracing the lines. "As the will states, Mrs. Holloway, the remainder of Mr. Caldwell's estate, encompassing all real and intellectual properties, financial accounts, and business interests, is bequeathed to his wife, Eleanor Morrison Holloway." He looked up, his expression unwavering. "The bulk of Arthur's estate, therefore, goes to Eleanor." "The bulk?" Claire finally managed, her voice thin with outrage. "What do you mean, the bulk? The house? His business? What exactly are we talking about here?" She practically spat the words, her eyes narrowed to slits. It was Victoria Shaw who stepped forward, her voice calm and imbued with an air of professional detachment that was almost chilling. She opened a slim briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized folder. "To clarify for the record," she began, her gaze sweeping across the stunned family members, "Mrs. Morrison Holloway inherits all real property, including the primary residence and any other real estate held by Mr. Caldwell. She inherits all financial accounts, including savings, checking, and investment portfolios directly in Mr. Caldwell's name. She inherits all business assets, including his consulting firm, its client lists, and all associated intellectual property, and of course, all personal property." Her voice was precise, each word a hammer blow against their collapsing worldview. Ben, his face pale with a mixture of anger and confusion, flatly declared, "That's impossible. My father would never leave us so little. This isn't right. It has to be a mistake or a forgery." Robert Maxwell, his voice firm and unwavering, interjected, "The will is quite legal, Ben. Arthur was very specific in his instructions, meticulously preparing this document over several years, ensuring its legality, and his wishes were undeniable. He signed it, it was witnessed by myself and other disinterested parties, and it was updated just 6 months ago." Brenda, her face now a blotchy red, erupted. She slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "But she didn't earn any of it. She never worked. She was just there, riding on his coattails. A gold digger, I tell you." Her voice was shrill, uncontrolled, fueled by a potent cocktail of greed and fury. The phrase, "just there," resonated deeply within me, echoing the cruel words Brenda had flung at me the night they evicted me from my home. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the perfect opening. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed back my chair and stood. My movements were fluid, unhurried, commanding a silent attention that Brenda's outburst had failed to achieve. I met Brenda's furious gaze, then slowly turned to encompass Ben, Claire, and finally Daniel, who still refused to look me in the eye. A serene, almost placid expression settled on my face. "You're absolutely right, Brenda," I said, my voice soft, calm, yet carrying a surprising resonance that cut through the lingering tension. "I never contributed anything to Arthur's success, not to Arthur's consulting firm, not to the modest investments he made in his own name. Those were indeed all his. My unexpected agreement threw them into disarray. Their faces, moments before contorted with rage, now twisted into expressions of utter confusion. This wasn't the expected fight, the indignant denial, the tearful pleading they had anticipated. This was something else entirely. They exchanged bewildered glances, clearly unsure how to proceed when their carefully constructed narrative was met with such an unsettling admission. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting their confusion deepen, letting the implications of my words sink in. Then I continued, my voice strengthening, gaining a quiet power that drew every eye to me. "But Arthur's estate," I continued, "isn't what you think it is, and I'm certainly not who you think I am." The statement hung in the air, a challenge, a riddle, an ominous pronouncement. Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning apprehension. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of mirth, but of cold, calculated satisfaction. The time had come to begin revealing the truth, piece by painstaking piece. "What I mean," I replied, my gaze sweeping over each of them, letting my words sink into their stunned minds, "is that you've been operating under some very expensive assumptions about who owns what in this family." The silence that followed my statement, "You've been operating under some very expensive assumptions about who owns what in this family," was electric. It was no longer just shock. It was a dawning realization, a creeping unease that began to spread across the faces of Ben, Claire, Daniel, and Brenda. They looked at each other, then back at me, their eyes now tinged with genuine fear. Victoria Shaw, sensing the perfect moment, stepped forward. She moved with an almost predatory grace, her presence commanding attention without a single shouted word. She placed a sleek, leather-bound folder on the table before her, its contents unseen but clearly voluminous. "Perhaps," Victoria began, her voice calm and measured, "we should clarify some of those assumptions." She glanced at Robert, who offered a slight nod. Robert leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the family. "Let me ask a simple question, then, to put things into perspective. Do you truly believe, even now, that Arthur actually owned all the assets his family believes they're inheriting?" Brenda, despite her earlier bluster, hesitated. A flicker of doubt, a nascent uncertainty crossed her features. "Of course he did," she insisted, though her voice lacked the previous conviction. "The house, the business, everything. It was all Arthur's. He built it." Victoria Shaw smiled, a thin, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Without a word, she opened her folder and extracted a single sheet of paper, presenting it to Michael Hayes. "This," she announced, her voice resonating with quiet authority, "is the deed to the property at 47 Elm Street, the residence you refer to as the house." Michael Hayes took the document, his eyes scanning the details. His own expression, already weary, now shifted to one of profound surprise. He looked up, first at Victoria, then at me. "As you can see, Mr. Hayes," Victoria continued, "the listed owner, since 2008, is Eleanor Morrison." Another stunned silence descended. Ben snatched the deed from Michael Hayes, his eyes darting across the document. "Morrison," he sputtered. "Who is Eleanor Morrison?" Then his gaze snapped to mine, a slow, dawning comprehension twisting his features. "Your maiden name? But that doesn't make any sense. Arthur bought that house decades ago," Robert Maxwell calmly interjected. "Indeed he did, Ben. But in 2007, Arthur decided to refinance the property. At that time, Eleanor provided the substantial capital needed for the refinancing, and in a perfectly legal transaction, the ownership of the property was formally transferred into her name. Arthur had always been a man who believed in protecting his assets and his wife." "What capital?" Ben demanded, his voice rising in incredulity. "She never had any money. She married my father with nothing." I stepped forward slightly, meeting his gaze directly. On the contrary, Ben, I stated, my voice even and calm, I inherited a considerable sum from my first marriage in 1995. A settlement, you might say, that left me financially independent long before I ever met your father. My first marriage, a brief but intense affair, had ended tragically with my husband's sudden passing. But his family, a prominent and wealthy lineage, had ensured my future was secure. Arthur had respected my privacy about this, and together we had built a life that appeared to the outside world to be solely dependent on his success. Daniel, still clinging desperately to their crumbling narrative, weakly interjected, "But you never worked. You told us yourself you never contributed to Arthur's business." "And I stand by that statement," I replied, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. "I never worked for Arthur's business. No, but not working is a very different thing from not generating wealth. While Arthur focused on his consulting firm, I managed my own investments. I bought and sold properties. I made business decisions. I simply did it, quietly, away from the glare of public scrutiny that Arthur, and frankly I, preferred to avoid." Victoria Shaw then presented another set of documents. "These," she announced, "are the ownership papers for Morrison Holdings, LLC, established in 1999 with Eleanor Morrison as the sole proprietor." She paused, letting the information sink in. "This LLC, gentlemen and ladies, owns 17 properties across 3 states. She spread out architectural blueprints and detailed property lists, the sheer volume of paper overwhelming the table. These include the 3 Manhattan apartment complexes you were so keen to dismiss, Mrs. Caldwell," she said, nodding pointedly at Claire, who now looked utterly bewildered. "And, of course, the warehouse building in Soho, valued at approximately $28 million. That's just one property, mind you." Robert Maxwell picked up a thick binder. "Would you like to see the complete portfolio? The bank statements, the investment records, the property deeds for all 17 properties, the numerous financial accounts, the varied investment vehicles, the offshore trusts?" He began to lay out document after document, a tidal wave of evidence that confirmed a financial empire far beyond anything they had ever conceived. The combined assets, he explained, totaled approximately $47 million. In stark contrast, he then placed a single thin folder next to the burgeoning pile. "Arthur Caldwell's personal estate," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion, "consists of approximately $300,000 in business assets and personal effects, as outlined in the will Michael Hayes just read." The family stared at the mountain of documents before them, then at the paltry folder representing Arthur's actual estate. Their faces were ashen, a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a dawning, terrible understanding. The comfortable, wealthy future they had envisioned, the inheritance they believed was theirs, was gone, dissolved, reduced to a pittance. Brenda, her face a mask of abject terror, finally broke the suffocating silence. "You're lying," she shrieked, her voice thin and reedy, completely devoid of its former power. "This is all a lie, a trick. She's lying." But even as she spoke, her eyes darted to the overwhelming evidence on the table, and her voice lacked any real conviction. The truth, stark and undeniable, was now laid bare. Brenda's accusation of lying, delivered with a desperate, terrified whine, hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. The mountain of legal documents on the table spoke a truth far more powerful than her desperate protestations. I let her words linger for a moment, then stepped forward, my gaze unwavering as I fixed it on her. "Which part would I be lying about, Brenda?" I asked, my voice calm, almost detached. "The part where I've been financially independent, a successful businesswoman in my own right for decades? Or the part where you've been living in my house for the past week, making yourselves comfortable with my property?" Brenda flinched as if I had physically struck her. Her face, already pale, now drained of all color, leaving her mottled and sickly. The other family members, Ben, Claire, and Daniel, remained stunned, their eyes darting between Brenda, the documents, and me, trying to piece together this shattering reality. Ben, finally finding his voice, albeit a shaky one, asked, "But why, Eleanor? Why didn't Arthur ever say anything? Why did he let us believe?" His voice trailed off, unable to articulate the full extent of their colossal misjudgment. Arthur was a proud man, Ben, I explained, my voice softening slightly, a momentary glimpse of the grief that still resided within me. He wanted to be seen as the provider, the patriarch. And I continued, my gaze firming, I preferred my privacy. I understood that true power often operates most effectively in the shadows. We had an arrangement, an understanding. His public persona, my quiet strength. Daniel, whose face had been a mask of confusion, suddenly stiffened. A slow, agonizing realization began to dawn on him. "So when we asked you to leave," he stammered, his voice barely audible, "you were actually—" I finished his sentence for him, my voice devoid of emotion. "I was being evicted from my own home, Daniel. The home I technically own, the home whose mortgage, property taxes, utilities, and insurance I had personally funded for years. Arthur's income, while substantial, primarily covered our daily expenses, groceries, incidentals, and his modest business operations. My investments, my properties, covered the true cost of our opulent lifestyle." Brenda began to shake, a visible tremor running through her body. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice hoarse with a new accusation. You let us think. You let us believe you were nothing." "I let you reveal exactly who you were, Brenda," I corrected, my tone unwavering. "I didn't force you to throw me out of my own house. I didn't compel you to call me a gold digger, a sanashuga, a bloodsucker, in front of a room full of grieving mourners. I didn't make you treat a grieving widow, your supposed family, with such contempt and malice. Those were all your choices, your words, your actions." Michael Hayes, who had remained largely silent, looking increasingly overwhelmed by the unfolding drama, finally spoke up. "Mr. Maxwell, Ms. Shaw, is all of this legally sound? All documentation is legitimate?" Robert nodded. "Every single piece of documentation is legally verified and irrefutable, Mr. Hayes. And Eleanor had no legal obligation whatsoever to disclose her personal financial holdings to Arthur's family, or anyone else for that matter. Her assets were entirely separate from Arthur's, accumulated independently, and carefully managed by her, with my assistance, for nearly 2 decades. Ben, his head bowed, finally looked up, his face etched with defeat. "But what does this mean for us?" he asked, his voice a pathetic whimper. Victoria Shaw, ever the pragmatist, delivered the final crushing blow with clinical efficiency. "It means, Mr. Caldwell, that you, your sister, and your cousin inherit exactly what your father bequeathed to you in his will, $50,000 each. No more, no less." Then her gaze, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, turned to Brenda. "And as for you, Mrs. Holloway, you are currently residing in Mrs. Morrison's property without her permission. As of this moment, you and your husband are, technically, trespassers." I took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. I looked at Brenda, then at Daniel, whose face was now a mask of utter despair. "I'll give you 72 hours, I declared, my voice resonating with an authority I had long kept hidden. 72 hours to remove your belongings from my house. After that, I will have you legally evicted. And I assure you the process will be swift and thorough, with no regard for any sentimental value you might suddenly pretend to have for my property." Brenda stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears, real tears this time, began to stream down her face. "Eleanor, please," she wailed, her voice desperate and pleading. "Please, we can work something out. We're family." She even used my maiden name, a desperate attempt at familiarity. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt nothing but a profound emptiness where anger might have been. The woman before me was not family. She was a stranger, a caricature of greed and malice. "You know, Brenda," I responded, my voice calm and devoid of warmth, "you're absolutely right. We are family, and you've just taught me exactly what that word means to you." With that, I turned and walked toward the door, Robert and Victoria falling into step behind me. As I left the conference room, leaving behind the wreckage of their shattered illusions, I felt a profound shift within myself. The invisible widow, the compliant wife, the underestimated presence, She was gone forever. In her place stood Eleanor Morrison, a woman reborn, ready to reclaim her life and her power. The air outside felt fresh, invigorating, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere I had just left behind. The 72 hours following the will reading were, without exaggeration, the most satisfying 3 days of my life since Arthur's passing. The grieving widow, cast aside and deemed inconsequential, was now a woman in command, orchestrating the quiet dismantling of their hubris. My phone, which had previously been silent, save for Brenda's early, imperious calls, now rang incessantly with her frantic attempts. Her voicemails, filled with desperate pleas and increasingly frantic apologies, were a far cry from the venomous accusations of a sanashuga. Each unanswered call, each blocked number, was a small victory. I remembered her words, the cold, calculated cruelty, and felt no pity. On the second day, a knock came at my hotel room door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there looking utterly miserable. His usual jovial demeanor was replaced by a pallor of distress, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, burdened by the full weight of his colossal error. "Eleanor," he began, his voice hoarse, I wanted to apologize. I never meant. I got caught up. Brenda, she's so persuasive." He launched into a rambling stream of excuses, attempting to shift the blame, to absolve himself of responsibility. I cut him off, my voice firm but quiet. "Daniel, stop. Let's be honest with each other. You wanted me gone. You, Ben, and Claire. You all wanted me gone so you could have everything you believed Arthur had left behind. You saw a vulnerable old woman, an obstacle, and you acted accordingly." He flinched, the truth of my words undeniable. His shoulders slumped. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "We did. We were fools, greedy fools. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. Truly, I don't know what to do. What are you going to do to us?" He looked at me, a genuine fear in his eyes, a naked vulnerability that finally touched a chord within me. Looking at Daniel, broken and repentant, I realized something important. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted them to learn, to truly understand the consequences of their actions, to stand on their own 2 feet, and to finally shed the parasitic entitlement that had defined their relationship with Arthur. Destruction would be too easy, too swift. Learning real growth, that would be the true punishment, and perhaps their salvation. "The eviction deadline stands, Daniel," I said, my voice unwavering. "You have until tomorrow afternoon to remove your belongings. Beyond that, I will not pursue any further legal action against you, or Ben, or Claire, regarding the past. The $50,000 Arthur left you is yours, but from now on, you will need to learn to live your own lives, make your own decisions, and build your own futures without relying on Arthur's imagined wealth or mine." He looked at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Relief perhaps, but also a dawning understanding of the long, hard road ahead. He nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He turned and left, his departure marking a fundamental shift in our relationship, from one of resentment and expectation to one, perhaps, of reluctant respect and a painful understanding. The next day, as the 72-hour deadline approached, I drove back to the house. Arthur's house, my house. The scene that greeted me was precisely what I had anticipated. All 4 of them, Ben, Claire, Daniel, and Brenda, were there, along with 2 older, elegantly dressed individuals I recognized as Brenda's parents, George and Carol Davies. They were huddled in the living room, a palpable tension in the air, clearly engaged in a heated war council. I let myself in with my own key, the click of the lock echoing loudly in the tense silence. Their heads snapped up, their expressions a mixture of shock and renewed anger. "It is my house, after all," I stated, my voice cutting through their surprised gasps. "And the deadline, I believe, is now." Brenda, ever resilient in her delusion, sprang to her feet. "Eleanor, you can't just barge in here. We're discussing a reasonable settlement for all the improvements we've made." Her voice, though still tinged with panic, held a hint of her old demanding tone. George and Carol, Brenda's parents, looked at her, then at me, their faces etched with confusion. They had clearly been told a very different version of events, one that painted me as a manipulative, opportunistic widow. This was an unexpected development, but a welcome one. Improvements? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Brenda, you've been living here for less than a week. And what improvements would those be? The new arrangement of Arthur's office, perhaps? I chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. And a settlement for what? For squatting in a property you have no claim to? Then I turned my attention to George and Carol, my voice losing its sarcastic edge, becoming clear and direct. Mr. and Mrs. Davies, I understand your daughter may have given you a selective account of the recent events. But the truth is I, Eleanor Morrison, am the sole legal owner of this house, and indeed the majority of the assets Arthur Caldwell was associated with. Arthur's estate, the actual estate, totals a mere $300,000. My personal empire, independently built and managed for decades, is worth approximately $47 million. Brenda and her family attempted to evict me from my own home a week ago, believing I was penniless and weak, all to seize what they imagined was Arthur's vast wealth. George and Carol stared at me, their faces slowly draining of color. The shock on their faces was profound, almost physical. They looked at Brenda, then back at me, a deep disappointment settling in their eyes. Brenda, George said, his voice quiet, heavy with shame. Is this true? Brenda tried to bluster, to deny, but the words caught in her throat. She looked from her parents' disapproving faces to my unwavering gaze, and finally her resistance crumbled. She remained silent, her shame a palpable thing. Carol, her expression one of utter mortification, stood up. George, she said, her voice trembling, I think we should leave. She turned to me, her eyes filled with apology. Eleanor, I am so deeply sorry. This is beyond belief. George nodded, offering me a look of profound regret, and together they quietly exited the house, leaving behind a stunned and devastated Brenda. The silent departure of her parents, her last bastion of support, was a more powerful blow than any of my words. I looked at the remaining three, my voice firm. You have 20 minutes. 20 minutes to gather any remaining personal belongings. After that, I will be changing the locks, and this time, you will not be coming back. Brenda, tears streaming down her face, looked at me, a flicker of her old defiance returning, though now laced with pure malice. This isn't over, Eleanor, she shrieked. I simply looked at her, a faint, weary smile touching my lips. Yes, Brenda, I replied, my voice gentle but resolute. Yes, it is. 6 months had passed since the will reading, 6 months of quiet rebuilding. I had moved back into my home, the familiar comfort now tinged with a new sense of ownership and peace. The garden, a place Arthur had always loved, flourished under my renewed care. I was pruning a particularly stubborn rosebush, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, displaying Mercy General Hospital. Mrs. Holloway? A calm, professional voice asked. This is Dr. Emily Gray. We have a patient here, Daniel Hayes, who was involved in a car accident. He's listed you as his emergency contact. My heart gave a jolt. Despite everything, Daniel was family. Is he all right? I asked, a tremor in my voice. He's stable, Dr. Gray assured me. Sustained some injuries, but nothing life-threatening. He's asking for you. I drove to the hospital, the familiar knot of dread and concern tightening in my stomach. I found Daniel in a private room, looking pale and bruised, his arm in a sling and a bandage across his forehead. But his eyes, though weary, held a clarity I hadn't seen in them for years. Eleanor, he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips when he saw me. I sat by his bedside, a comfortable silence settling between us. He looked around the empty room, then back at me. Brenda, she left, he said, his voice flat. Took everything she thought was hers, which wasn't much once the truth came out. Said she couldn't be with a loser. A pang of sympathy, unexpected but genuine, went through me. He was truly alone now, stripped bare of all his former props and illusions. He looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. Eleanor, he began, his voice choked with emotion. I am so sorry. For everything. For what I said, for what I did. For not defending you. For letting Brenda and Ben and Claire treat you like dirt. You were always kinder to me than anyone. more of a mother in many ways than my own biological mother ever was. And I let greed blind me. His remorse felt genuine, raw, unvarnished by pretense or self-pity. The Daniel who spoke now was a very different man from the one who had averted his gaze in the conference room. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Daniel," I admitted, my hand instinctively reaching out to lightly touch his bandaged arm. It was true. Despite his actions, I wouldn't wish this kind of pain or abandonment on anyone. "I deserved it," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I see now what I threw away. It wasn't just Arthur's money or yours. It was the one person in my life who loved me unconditionally, who had my back even when I didn't deserve it. You and Arthur, you always did." His words struck a chord within me. "I understand, Daniel," I said, "because I too realized something important during all of this. I was losing an illusion of a loving family, a family that, in truth, valued me not for who I was, but for what I could provide, or what they imagined I would provide. My worth to them was based on provision, not on me." I paused, looking at him intently. "And you, Daniel, you didn't know the real me either. You only knew the role I played, the quiet, supportive wife, the woman who let herself be underestimated." He nodded, absorbing my words. "But I want to know the real you, Eleanor," he said, his voice earnest. "If you'd let me." A deep sigh escaped me, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The anger, the resentment had dissipated, replaced by a cautious hope. "We can try, Daniel," I offered, a small, genuine smile forming on my lips. "We can start over. A relationship not based on expectations or inheritance, but based on who we actually are. But it will be on my terms. I am no longer the invisible woman. I will not rescue you from your consequences. You've learned to stand on your own 2 feet, and you must continue to do so." He accepted, his gratitude shining in his eyes. There was a genuine remorse, yes, but also a determination to do better, to truly embrace this newfound independence. I encouraged him, not with money, but with advice, with a renewed connection, and with the simple, profound act of listening. "What about Ben and Claire, Shyam?" he asked after a while, his voice hesitant. I shook my head gently. "That's up to them, honey. My door is open, but they have to choose to walk through it. I won't chase them. They need to come to their own realizations, just as you have." "And Brenda?" he whispered, almost an afterthought. "Brenda burned that bridge herself," I stated, my voice firm, all traces of softness gone. "Some actions have consequences that can't be undone. What she did, what she said, was unforgivable. I wish her no ill will, but I also have no place for her in my life." Leaving the hospital, I felt a profound sense of lightness, a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of expectations, of playing a role, had lifted. Arthur had, in his final act, given me not just financial security, but the courage to be my authentic self. I had confronted the greed, set firm boundaries, and in Daniel I saw a glimmer of hope for a genuine connection. My true worth, I realized, was not just in the $47 million empire I commanded, but in the unwavering strength of my spirit, the resilience of my heart, and the quiet power of knowing exactly who I was.